Hi, Misha here, and this is the second part, or second half, in a very thorough look at the postban MAK-90, specifically the milled version, imported in 1993. In part 1, talked a bit about the history, how these came in, also about the conversion process for this rifle, and compared it with a couple of other Chinese guns. And in this video, I thought we would compare it with other contemporaries that it would have been found in gun shops with in the 90s and 2000s, and talk about kind of the different stages, different levels of quote-unquote milled receivers. The milled MAK-90 comes in as a sporter gun. It is a slant cut receiver with the thumbhole stock originally. The scope rail, as I said, was added by the owner. It is a solid milled piece. It does have a standard mag weld. It's not a low cap or missing a bullet guide. Back in 93, high cap magazines, mags over 10 rounds, were not verboten. But these did have all of the cleaning rod hardware machined off the bottom of the barrel and the bayonet lug machined off. The owner added this back. Also, except for the first batch of MAK-90s, they came in with unthreaded barrels. The first batch did have threads under a welded cap. Obviously the cheese grater handguard he added as well. So basically the barrel assembly was pretty heavily sporterized, and the rear took a special slant cut stock, but the middle part, the magwell and the internals, were all Chinese. And before I forget, every gun on the table fires 7.62 by 39 millimeter M43 Russian. So let's look at the other guns, talk about what they are, and then we'll talk about how they shoot. First off, a gun that's been in a lot of old videos but hasn't appeared recently a whole lot. My Russian early Type 3 build on a Firingline US made milled receiver. And I brought it out because I wanted to talk about this. This is, at some points, one of the most common styles for a milled AK, because parts kits with original barrels were available pretty heavily from the 90s until 2006. This one was built with a so-called PLO kit, which were captured from the Palestinians by the Israelis, sold over here, had the original receivers cut up. And even though many were sold with the stubs, back around 2000, people didn't really do rewelds on a mass level, so people would buy complete US receivers like this one here. And these were nice from Firingline because they had the original threaded front end, so the barrel just screwed in. It wasn't a pin and press. Of course, there's different levels of these guns depending on the kit used and the quality of the builder, so on and so forth. But this is one level of mill gun. So you have original surplus barrel assembly mated to a US receiver with a semi-auto trigger group. And then of course the furniture in the back. Another way of doing that is a reweld. This is one of the few AK rewelds I own. This is a Yugoslavian M70 kit, again with the original barrel that had the original front stub welded to a repair section made in the US. Sometimes the entire back will be US made, sometimes it's just the middle part depending on how much of the original kit was left. This style has become very popular in recent years. People will pay big money for a reweld. And if done correctly, it's almost as good as a complete receiver. But keep in mind, you are joining two pieces of metal together, one used from how many years ago and one new from the USA. The thing is, you can't always visually tell if a weld is good or not, if the heat treats right, until and unless it breaks. So I really found that rewelds tend to be more collector's guns to preserve any original markings than they are shooters. But these Yugo kits were cheap, so why not? I picked one up years ago. And that's another way you can get a mill gun. And a lot of people consider these a little more authentic because at least part of the receiver is original comm block. Another way are these two guns here. Let's talk about this one first. This is my SLR100H, one I bring out a lot. And this represents what a lot of builders would do. They would take an original parts kit, like a PLO, but instead of using a US-made receiver or rewelding the original, for a time these Arsenal Bulgarian receivers were available, and so people would use these. So you'll see Hungarian, Polish, even Russian kits built up on these. Very common receiver back in the early 2000s. These are original milled receivers, which is nice. They did come in with standard mag wells, so no need to modify. On the other hand, since these are newer production, they were meant for press and pin barrels. Now you had a couple of options. Most builders, like on this one from MSC, would simply turn the threads down on the barrel and make the original barrel a press and pin barrel. It's easier to headspace, easier to get the timing right. Some builders, though, would go the opposite direction, and they would fill in the pinhole and then thread the front of the receiver to take the original barrel. That is certainly a way to do it. It's more labor intensive, but it does make a more authentic gun. But all the three we've looked at so far have been parts guns, assembled here from kits to one degree or another. Here is my Bulgarian SA93, and I've done a few videos on it. You can check it out in the playlist. This guy is very much contemporary of the MAK-90, even having the same year, although these actually I don't think hit the market till 94, but I'm sure there are plenty of milled MAK-90s still in shops in 94. Like the MAK-90, these came in as complete, ready-to-fire sporters. They had unmolested mag wells. They could take standard mags because, again, back in 93, 94, it didn't matter. Unlike the MAK-90, these had a standard square cut receiver in the back, which is good. They even had a standard top tang. The only thing is, to get the thumb hole stock to fit properly, they lacked a bottom tang originally. But it's really not a big deal to install one. In fact, some of the receivers were still dovetailed on the underside for it. And they took a standard pistol grip without fuss as well. The front ends of these were much like the... I'm going to move around here. I'm in the kitchen because it's a little easier with so many guns. The front ends, unfortunately, were just as neutered as the MAK-90s. They removed the front where the Type 1 bayonet lug would have been. They also removed the hardware for the cleaning rod originally. And they even, like the MAK-90, didn't have the hole in the handguard retainer. Again, as I said in video 1, for some reason in the early 90s, they really hated cleaning rods. The only slightly better aspect, the MAK-90s barrels typically had the original threads just turned off, meaning you would have to thread for a smaller diameter often. With the Arsenals, most came in, if not all, with barrels that were never threaded, which is good because that means you have the original larger diameter, meaning it's pretty easy to thread 14x1 left hand. Again, this is very much a contemporary of the MAK-90 and requires about the same level of conversion. And then finally, the current one, you all know, another Arsenal, another import, the SA-M7R. I've got mine in M9 furniture, but this is an import. Because it came in post-97, when imported, the mag well was restricted to single stack. And originally they sold the progenitor to this, the SLR100H, taking single stack mags. In fact, that was really the first import that Arsenal Incorporated in Las Vegas ever did. But very soon they would start converting the mag wells to take standard mags, and it's a very easy process. Most people don't even realize there is any work done in the US. With a machined receiver, it's very easy to get it out. Right? But one good thing, even though these do come in with the thumb hole stock, they also come into the country with the lower tang installed, ready to have a standard buttstock put on and pistol grip. And similarly, they finally quit taking away the cleaning rod, and they would thread the barrel. Now, when these come in, they are threaded 14x1 left hand, and they have a cap. And while they have the blocks for the bayonet and accessory lug, the machining is not finished out. They're left unmachined, the slots on the side, so they can't accept it, all to comply with laws. So in the US, Arsenal simply machines out the lugs, puts on a bit of touch-up paint, and usually they ship these with 14mm front ends. I put the 24 on it. It's very easy to do, but some of them, like the SAM-7 SF, do come with the 24mm threads and removable muzzle device, so both have been optional, but 14 is more common. The point is, typically when these leave Arsenal Incorporated, the importer, they're full-featured and don't require conversion work. Now, a nominal number of US parts need to be added for sale, 5 on a mill gun, which are typically some bits of your furniture, fire control group, and or muzzle device. Again, you have some options. Even magazines count for 3 parts. So that's one way to easily do it, meaning things like the bolt carrier can be left untouched. To be fair though, technically guns like the MAK-90 when they're converted, or the SA93, are in the same boat, so it really doesn't matter. So that's kind of a rundown of other milled guns. As far as imports, post-ban, post-1989 ban, the only milled imports we've had are the Arsenals and the Chinese. That's it. Now there are the Czech VZ58s, which are milled. Excellent rifles, excellent, but not AKs, so I didn't bring one out this time. There are also the Galils and Galil Aces, but again, excellent rifles. To me, a Galil is a Galil. It's different enough from a Kalashnikov that it's a Galil. Now, pre-ban, of course, you have some milled Yugos that came in. You have the finished Valmets, 2 different patterns of milled. And of course you have the Polytech guns. But even then, mill guns have always been far less common than stamped, which makes them more desirable right off the bat. But the question is, are mill guns better than stamped, or is it just the rarity that kind of gets people all hot and bothered? Well, let's run a few rounds, and then we'll compare these with the MAK-90. SA93. In the court of public opinion, if there is a gun that gives the MAK-90 a run for its money, it is this one. They are well known, the opinion is, of course, reliability. Many say this is the finest arsenal ever made, the first one. People talk about the triggers, how smooth they are. And they are a relatively straightforward conversion, especially if you don't want a full front end done. It's also neat being the first arsenal Bulgaria import. And as for kit guns, Hungarian AK-55. Okay, I know, technically this is an SLR100H, but since several kits were built on these, I still tend to think of it as an AK-55. So this is obviously a US assembled gun, but all the components, barrel, receiver, furniture, are original. And this is combining, again, used surplus with a new Bulgarian import receiver. So the quality of the receiver, since it was made around the same time as the SA93, is going to be about the same. The barrels on guns like these could be mint new, or they could be well worn. It's just the luck of the draw with surplus. But on, of course, the SA93, if you buy one new, you get a new barrel. That's how they were built. That said, we've had perfect reliability out of this SLR100H, which is a factory-built gun. We've also tried in the past ones from Gordon Tech and had no problems. So moving out of the 90s, what about more recent offerings? SAM-7R. This rifle is imported under the same rules and restrictions as the MAK-90 and the SA93, dating back to 1989, with the only real change being the magazine, well, not allowed to come in accepting high-cap mags. Now, on some guns this can be problematic, especially stamped receivers if they don't cut them out properly. But Arsenal in Bulgaria does a very minimal job of restricting the magwell, much like how Molot in Russia used to do. And Arsenal, incorporated in Las Vegas, opens them up in such a way that you'd never know work was really done. That's my opinion, but I'm right. Much like with the SA93, if you buy one of these new, you know you're getting a new barrel. But unlike the others we've looked at, this is based on the newer pattern, the AR-M1 pattern. Now, I've covered this in several videos. I don't want to repeat myself, but long story short, they took the milled receiver from the Type 3 and they plunked an AK-74 style front end on it. So you get the lighter weight barrel, the modern gas block. You can't have the more modern front sight base. Most of the military guns do. But it still takes milled stocks, handguards, and all that good jazz. These are true imports, just like the others, and have been pretty consistently available. There was a run of SLR101s back in the early 2000s, and they would stop for a while. Then they brought it back in 2012 as the SLR101S, and then in 2013 they changed the name to SAM-7R. This was mostly a political thing because California banned all SLRs by name, so they changed the name. A lot of times Arsenal/KVAR gets a lot of flack. I think people forget sometimes that in the past they have done really cool things like that. A lot of people in California were able to own this gun because they bothered to change the name. And by the way, when you change a name like that, you actually have to resubmit for ATF approval, even just for a name change. So they actually had to get a whole new approval for these guns. There are a few other minor differences between the original 101s, the newer 101s, and the SAM-7Rs, but really nothing more than just production. But like the rest, reliable, as accurate as any AK, and so on. And back to where we started. MAK-90 mil. And since we just covered this in a video, you know, it ran reliably. Did just fine. But of course, it was modified by the previous owner from its original import form. But that could be said for all of these. I mean, heck, if you want to be technical about it, since these are all semi-auto only and made so to meet ATF standards, none of these are mil-spec Kalashnikov type guns. It's not legal to own one unless it's a registered machine gun, and there are actually very few of those in the USA, especially that aren't post samples. This is something to keep in mind. When you buy any AK, any original military type gun, it has to be modified in some way for the civilian market. And that can play a major role. You know, if a good gun gets imported by a bad company that uses bad parts to convert it, yeah. On the other hand, a good importer can take a gun that comes in mediocre, do a little polishing and fitting, and make a really good gun out of it. So we have to kind of judge them based on what we have here. Keep in mind, most of us have not had extensive trigger time with real military Kalashnikovs, so what we think we know about them is pretty secondhand and anecdotal. Just gotta say that. With all of that said, every single one of these mil guns is reliable and seems to be well built. But I promised we would kind of compare this MAK-90 to some of its contemporaries. So yeah, let's kind of do just that. So first up, comparing it with the Firingline receiver Russian PLO build. In between these takes, I'm picking each gun up, racking the action a few times, and pulling the trigger. I would prefer to show you that on camera, but rather impossible to do when it's me here alone. I asked the cats to hold the camera, let me do it while they film me. They ran off with it and hid it under the couch, so doing what I can do. Anywho, compared to the Russian build here has a smoother bolt. It doesn't have much rattle to it. Very polished feeling. And just very easy. I will also say this is a slightly heavier feeling gun. Part of it is that it has all original milled parts. Like, you know, the mag catch is the original thick milled style. The dust cover is actually from a late Type 2, so it's the heavy one. It has this heavy, solid wood furniture. Just all those things add up, plus I do think the Firingline receiver, oh yeah, and the bolt and bolt carrier don't have the lightning cuts. All these things add up just to make it a little chunkier, but a smoother gun. As far as the trigger, I'm gonna be honest, it's got a Chinese trigger in it, so it's not really fair to compare, but the Chinese copied their double hook trigger from the Russians, so, you know, theoretically quite similar. I will say this gun is a blast to shoot. It has no felt recoil. It's just one of those, it's a mill gun you put in someone's hands, but this was also a custom built gun from a boutique maker of receivers put together by a gunsmith by hand. So it should be better and tuned. The MAK-90 is the true definition of a assembly line gun. This was not assembled originally by gunsmiths. Far from it. These are mass production guns. The ALG trigger, though, is very nice. Moving on. Comparing it with the reweld M70. I've noticed the bolt travel on this compared with the MAK-90 is really about the same. They have about the same level of smoothness slash kind of rattle grittiness. On the Russian gun, when I pulled the bolt all the way back, there's absolutely no hitch at all. But on the Yugo and the MAK-90, when I get it all the way to the rear of its travel, there's the tiniest bit of catch or hitch as it gets to the end of the guide rails. You know how you pull an AK bolt carry all the way back to pull it out of the receiver. But once it's no longer 100% supported by the guide rails, only a little bit, they do tend to hitch just a tiny amount. I mean, it's nothing you'd notice at the range. It's just something if you're really being critical. But they both kind of have a very similar feel with the tiniest bit of grit in the bolt travel and that little bit of hitch in the back. And then the trigger, this has a Yugo trigger in it. If we consider the Chinese trigger and this Russian to be an example, I will say that the Chinese trigger is better. The overall feel's about the same, but the Yugo trigger just has a little more grit in it. Now this is a semi-auto only Yugo trigger, so keep that in mind. It's just a little bit grit, still a good trigger, better than most single hooks. You know, this gun was interesting. It has the one lightning cut on the right side, but they eliminated it on the left. And this is, you know, a press and pin barrel. So it's a milled receiver, but it is a simplified version. It, too, weighs a little more because of that, plus the heavier top cover, and having the grenade accoutrements on it, and the longer wood handguards. Yeah, the Yugo guns are known for being a little chunky. I do like this reweld. I just, again, reiterate, if you're doing a reweld, really make sure the quality's good, know what you're getting into, or just don't overpay for it. I can't say I think rewelds are awesome for preserving the original receiver markings, but I will never think of them the same as a wholly assembled receiver. They are still two parts welded together. At least with like a US receiver like this, it is made as one piece, one unit. But on the other hand, AKs do lock up in the front, not in the rear like an FAL, and most cuts are in the middle or towards the rear of the lightning cut, the magwell, so you're usually pretty good, honestly. Well, what about its very similar cousin rifle here? I would definitely say the SA93 has a smoother bolt. It's much more on par with the Firingline receiver. The trigger has the same pull and is just as light as the Chinese trigger, but because the Chinese is kind of either blued or just left with the straw coloring. And the Arsenal does have a finish. The Arsenal has the tiniest bit of grit to it, which I'm sure if you fired it enough it would work out. It's also a lighter gun than the Chinese because of the furniture I have on mine, which is the original military furniture. Bakelite, handguards, and all that stuff, and then the polymer grips. But yeah, it's a very smooth gun. And these were put together on assembly lines, but they were imported in much smaller numbers. And again, this was Arsenal's first import, so usually at the beginning, companies really want to impress. Well, that's a factory-built Arsenal gun. What about a gun on an Arsenal receiver? Since these receivers were sold as just virgin receivers, and then were built up by gunsmiths, using kits from all nations and qualities, my rifle is really only an example of itself. With that said, mine here, they did a damn good job. The bolt travel is nearly as smooth as that on the Firingline gun. I think the only reason it's not as smooth is because it is a phosphate finish. Now I will say the trigger, while it's pretty much the same as the rest, a machine trigger, is grittier, probably again because of finish. And it has more of the weight like the Russian or Yugo guns because it's solid wood, and it has the early milled mag catch. That's actually one reason I kept this one over the Gordon Tech. A lot of the Gordon Techs, they use the modern Arsenal mag catch here. But MSC took the trouble to pull it off and put on the original Hungarian, which is, you know, a flat surface, and it's just different, you can tell. Same with like the takedown button in the back and the rear sight. There are ways to tell original 50s production milled parts from modern ones. The front sights were machined, of course, on these. The later ones, they'd go to castings. You can just tell. I really like this gun. These were mass produced, at least as far as kit builds go. And if you get a good one, which any of the real official ones tend to be pretty decent, it's a lot of fun. And because it's not a reweld, it's on an Arsenal receiver, it's going to have just as durable a receiver as any import. The thing is, just make sure who plugged it together did it right. And it should last you. And finally, our modern gun. And I just picked this one to kind of represent all Arsenals, not just the SAM-7R, but also the SAM-7 UF, SAM-7 SF, and even to some extent the SAM-7 K. SAM-7R. This might get me a little bit flamed, but racking the action on this SAM-7R is just the same as the SA93. The SA93 might be the ever so slightly bit smoother in the rear as it comes to the end of its travel, but both of them are just damn smooth. I will say this, on the other hand, this has a better feeling trigger. It doesn't have that grit in it like the SA93, and this is with the US hammer and disconnector. I'll save this for another video, but yeah, there's definitely a they don't make them like they used to mindset on Arsenals. I don't see that to be true. Maybe I'm incorrect. I mean, how much experience do I have? I probably know nothing. But in my experience, current import arsenals are more or less the same as they've always been. You might find one that's particularly better and one that's particularly worse, but yeah, they seem about the same. And comparing it to the Chinese, I noticed the Chinese gun still has more of that rattle and slop in the action compared with this. And in fact, the only gun on the table that seems about as rough on the bolt or as sloppy, and by that I mean like, you know, travel, kind of wigglies, hearing things move inside, is the Yugo. All the others, especially all the others really, just seem to be much smoother with less rattling sounds when you move the action. Now, in video 1 I had a speculation. I was wondering if it was the recoil guide. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So I took the recoil guide and spring out of the Hungarian Arsenal whatever build. Here it is. Notice this is an original 50s era production. It's basically a hollow tube ratting inside another hollow tube with the spring. And here's the one from the Chinese. Now I think the original owner probably put a Wolf extra power spring in this because it feels stiff. It's easy to change springs. But notice how it isn't solid. It's a later style. So let's put this in the Hungarian and this in the Chinese and see if that changes the travel at all. Oh yeah, he definitely put an extra power spring in, which is fine. There's pros and cons to that. But anyway, did it change much swapping them around? Honestly, not a whole lot. Not as much as I thought it would. I would say it did smoothen and tighten up the Chinese gun, kind of less rattly. It's hard to explain how things feel, you know? More straight back, which you'd expect when you have two solid tubes guiding each other versus, you know, two open ones. There's still a little bit of just a little bit of grittiness in this. And the Hungarian is still pretty smooth. I guess in this instance it's also partially part the Hungarian bolt group and the Arsenal receiver. It is a little bit grittier, kind of more rattly, but it's still smooth. So what do I think? Okay, objectively, you're not going to go wrong with any of these guns. Milled guns are fine guns if they're done correctly, true milled. I don't mean century or whatever milled, but actual milled guns. So objectively, pick whichever one speaks to you the most. Subjectively, the Chinese I'm kind of meh on. Especially internally, it's one of the rougher machined ones, frankly. Now, of course, that can be worn in, and if you shoot one enough, it usually is. But they do seem to be a little bit gritty when new, and even a little bit sloppy when shot in. At least we're comparing this to other milled guns, namely Arsenals, because that's what we've received over the years. But also even the US ones. The only other one that has about the same feel as the Chinese is the Yugo, which, since the bolt locks up in the front, at least that part, is original as a Stava receiver, but since it's a reweld, you know, the caveats I've said. The Chinese gun does feel a little bit lighter than some of the others. I think that's because it does use some modern components like the stamped catch. It uses a cast, or at least originally used a cast front sight. You know, ounces add up. In terms of just pure quality of niceness, yeah, this Russian build, but that's how builds are. You can make a build as nice as you want. I really do think the SA93 is a better gun than the milled MAK-90. But when these were both on the market, keep in mind this sold for considerably more money. Even back then, Arsenals were premium guns, whereas Chinese guns were good value guns, essentially. Both require the same level of conversion, except with the Arsenal, you don't have to mess with the slant cut receiver. All you have to do is install the lower tang. I consider that much easier than trying to get a stock to fit. But as far as converting the front ends, they're about the same. But again, the Arsenal is just maybe a little bit easier because you can just straight thread. The Chinese, you have to kind of work with what you've got on the shaved down barrel. So I just overall think the SA93 is a slightly higher quality gun, and that it's a slightly easier conversion. As I said in the first video, the Chinese bluing might be attractive, but it just doesn't resist rust that well. It tends to freckle, not really deeply rust. You can easily wipe it off, but it seems like it's kind of lacking a certain preventative. Now the Arsenal finish does get some grief because it's a paint, but it's a paint over phosphate. And while you might hear of bubbling paint on occasion, you really don't hear of rusting, much less pitting. So to me, a finish that protects is better than that. Of course, there's also phosphating you can do, so on. You know, guns like the reweld are definitely for collectibles, and guns like the PLO, with the price of kits today, are getting into that. So if you're looking for a collectible for your Chinese collection, maybe you have a Polytech Legend and want a shooter, this will be a good shooter for you. It is a true factory-built gun, as is the SA93 and the SAM-7R, for that matter. To us, the Arsenals just seem to be a bit smoother, a little more attention to detail, a little less machining visible. We also find them to be a little less punchy when it comes to shooting. Chinese guns, to us, seem like they feel a little overgassed. You know what I mean? Like it has that more back and forth, that teeter-totter you can feel, which makes sense because when they were making these in the 80s and 90s, they probably wanted to make sure they would be reliable. And of course, the blued finish and often polished bolt allow things to slip very easily with low friction. And then you have that wire type recoil system in them versus the tube, and it just seems like you feel a little more recoil, almost like shooting more of a stamped gun. Of these, I would definitely say the Hungarian here has the less recoil, probably the least amount felt recoil, because we have the old school wood furniture, the old school machined parts. When you get to newer guns like the SAM and the SA93, they're wearing newer, lighter furniture, and they're made with more stamped components, which just leads to more felt recoil. Again, I still think even then it's less than on the Chinese, but definitely the smoothest, lightest shooting, in my opinion, is this one, or the Russian. But we don't shoot the Russian much anymore. Just kind of no need. And I think aesthetics. I think the Bulgarian look and feel just speaks more to Jay and I. Some people go for the Chinese. That's fine. Chinese kind of did their own pattern. And of course Bulgaria is doing its own pattern with the AR-M1 and AR-M9 and so on and so forth. Kind of keeping an old design modern. Just really like mill guns. They've always proven to be reliable. In fact, the only one we've ever had trouble with was that pre-man Polytech Legend. And they're definitely a less common sight. I really think that's about it. I haven't really noticed any difference in things like mag wobble. Accuracy, you'd have to ask Jay on, but they're AKs. They're usually about as accurate as the ammo you put in them. And they are all reliable. So you gotta hand up to them on that. But since in video 1 we compared it with other Chinese guns, it only seemed fair to compare it with mill guns from other nations. Of course, we had to use kit guns here because we've never really had a milled Yugo or Russian import. Certainly post 1989, all we've really received have been from Bulgaria, or even if they're built here, a lot of them are on Bulgarian receivers. Arsenal has specialized in milled guns, and it really seems to show. Whereas China, by the 1980s, had really gone over till its 1.5mm stamped, having transitioned in the late 60s and into the early 70s away from milled. They mostly were doing milled guns for the American market to do replica Russian. That's why a Polytech Legend looks more like a Russian or an early type 56 than it does a more standard type 56. By that I mean having the open, not the closed front sight. Anyway, we know that Chinese guns are popular, and that milled Chinese guns are particularly popular, and that MAK-90s have been gaining in appreciation, attention, and unfortunately also cost in recent years. So it seemed like doing a couple of in-depth videos could be helpful and popular. If you have any questions we didn't answer in these, please post them below and we'll do our best to answer and maybe even give you a right answer. We have to say that Jay and I both own Arsenals, and that's probably going to stay that way. We probably aren't going to be replacing our Arsenals with milled Chinese anytime soon. Just personal preference. But there you have it. If you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to our Patreon page. Either way, we greatly appreciate you tuning in. And we will catch you very soon next time.